Hi, hello, vanakkam, and welcome back to yet another episode on your favorite Little Slaw YouTube channel. So, in this video, we're going to see about the continuation of one of our previous videos, where in a previous video we have discussed about how to set or how to determine the peak load for any load test, and we have discussed about the approaches for that. And again, the main objective or the main perspective was that the previous video is that in the previous video we discussed about how to determine the peak load for an application which is an existing application which has historical data. So in this video we're going to discuss about what if in a scenario where we do not have any historical data, and if it is like a new application that has been built from scratch, so how are we going to build or how are we going to determine the peak user load? And this is in fact one of the most frequently asked questions, and in fact even many of our performance testers or the engineers have or might need a little more input or insight onto how to decide on the load. So in this video we're going to see that part. And before we move on to this video, this is me, Vasan Shanmugam. I welcome you all to our Little Slaw YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't subscribed yet, and consider joining our channel. It's just 29 rupees per month, and you're going to get tons of videos, lots of help and support. And don't forget to subscribe, comment your questions and feedback in the comment section. If you have any questions, please do reach out to me in my WhatsApp channel. And now, with no further delay, let's go on to the first approach. So what is the first approach of determining the peak load for a new application? So the first approach is going to be gathering the requirements and stakeholder input. So for example, we have the business expectations and who are going to be the target audience when it comes to the gathering of requirements, when it comes to the business expectations. So we have to discuss with the business stakeholders to understand who the end users are, and we have to identify the demographics, the geographic locations, and the usage patterns, because every different country has its own level of audience and the amount of users are totally huge. Just imagine a country like India and a country like Denmark or Dutch or Germany. The amount of population, the amount of audience is lesser when compared to countries like India or China or the other countries. So that's the reason. So the first part is straight on hitting the bullseye. So we have to identify the demographics, the geographic location, and the usage patterns, and this can be known only when you discuss with your business stakeholders. And then the second part is expected user base. So we have to estimate the size of the user base. For example, if the application is aimed at a niche market, the user base may be smaller but highly engaged. So they will be smaller but still they will be highly engaged. They'll keep on accessing the application, they'll keep on hitting the traffic, hitting the network. So for a mass market application, the user base might be larger with more diverse usage patterns. So all these you will slowly understand only when you keep on understanding or when you keep on collecting those metrics. And then the usage pattern, so we have to determine how users are expected to interact with the application. Are they likely to log in daily or weekly or monthly or sporadically? And then the traffic drivers. So we have to identify for any upcoming events or any marketing campaigns or product launches that might drive the traffic. For example, a major marketing campaign or a feature rollout could significantly increase the traffic temporarily. And the second half of this gathering requirements and stakeholder input is the application use cases, where we have the primary actions of identifying the key actions the users will perform, such as browsing the products, adding items to a cart, making purchases, or even streaming videos. And also by using personas, where we can create detailed user personas to understand different user types and their behavior patterns. For example, one persona might be a frequent shopper while another might be a casual browser. So we have to create a detailed user personas, and then we have to decide on the frequency estimation. So we have to estimate how often these actions will be performed. For instance, if the application is an e-commerce site, we have to consider how often the users will search for products, add items to their cart, and complete their purchases. So that's all about the first topic, which is the gathering requirements and the stakeholder. And moving on to the second approach. So in the second approach, we will have to estimate the user load. So how can we estimate the user load? So the first phase of it is by doing user count estimation, where we must estimate the number of concurrent users. For instance, if you expect 10,000 users daily and the peak usage times to involve about 10% of users, so now you might plan for around 1,000 concurrent users. So just simple. So if you're expecting 20,000 users daily, then the peak usage is around 10%, which is 2,000 concurrent users. So same way, you can estimate the user count. And then the peak time, so you have to consider when the peak times are likely to occur, and this might be during the business hours for a business to business application, or evenings and weekends for a consumer application. So this way you can understand how the peak time works for us. And then the second phase of estimating the user load is through usage patterns. So we have to do a action breakdown. For example, the breakdown expected user actions into percentages. For example, 70% of users might be browsing, 20% might be searching for specific items, and 10% might be completing their purchases. So by this way you can do a action breakdown. And then by doing server load estimation, so we can estimate the server load for each action that it's getting generated. So by browsing, we might involve many read requests, while purchases might involve more write request and complex processing. So you understood the difference, right? So by browsing you're doing a get request, and by purchasing you're doing a write and a complex processing. So in that way you can estimate the server load, again, the amount of load that we generate. So that's all about the second approach. And moving on to the third approach now. So the third approach, we are going to define the load testing scenarios. So mainly it involves the scenario creation, where we have to create realistic scenarios that reflect how the users will interact with your application. For example, a scenario which involves user logging in, the browsing their products, adding items to the cart, and checking out. This is a very realistic scenario. And then by simulating the concurrency, where we can design the scenarios to simulate multiple users performing these actions simultaneously. For example, 500 users browsing, 300 users were searching, and 200 were purchasing at the same time. So this, in this way you can simulate a concurrency model. In that way you can define your load test scenario, and again it will indirectly help you to determine the peak user load. And moving on to the user journey, so we have to map the user journeys by mapping out the typical user journeys from start to finish, which includes variations to cover different paths which the users might take. And even the behavior variations also will help you, and this can be done by including different user behaviors, such as the users who logs out without making a purchase, or users who return items, or users who even abandon their cart. So again, these are also some of the things that happen when people are using the network. So again, these also has to be involved as part of your user journey, and by doing that you can collect the, or you can determine the peak load for your system. And then the use load testing tool, so that's the fourth approach, which is using load testing tools. So the first part is we have to choose the tools. For example, a tool like JMeter is actually an open source tool for load testing, and which is capable of simulating heavy loads on servers, networks, or objects. And then we have K6, which is a modern open source load testing tool that provides a scripting API in JavaScript, which makes it easy to create. And again, we have Load Runner, we have Gatling, all these tools. So again, these tools, by using these tools, we can determine the peak load. So how can we do it? So that's the next step, which is running initial tests and adjusting it. So initially we have discussed a similar kind of testing even in our previous video, like the baseline testing. So even the same approach is here as well, when you are doing it for for an application which is completely new and that's been built from scratch and that does not have any historical data. So the first part is baseline testing, where you have to do initial load test, and that starts with, you can start it with the load very lower number of concurrent users. You can start from like 100 users to establish a performance baseline. And also we can monitor metrics such as response times, the throughput, and the error rates. And then we can identify the bottlenecks, and for this you must use the initial test to identify any bottlenecks of our performance issues. So by doing these two, like the initial load test and by identifying the bottlenecks, we can very well do, or we can very well be prepared with the baseline testing. And then the next part is the iterative testing. So in the iterative testing we have three different steps. So one is incremental load increase, and then after that we do a monitor performance, and then we do a adjust and retest. So what do we do in incremental load increases? We gradually increase the load by increments, which is for example like 100 users at a time, to see how the application handles increasing stress. So in fact, we even have the same approach even for the application with historical data, but still, again, anyways, these approaches will definitely help us to identify to determine the peak load. So that's the reason we are using the same approach here. But again, this is again a last approach. So if nothing of the previous approaches did not help you to determine your peak load, you come up to this one because this is a proven one. It's an industry standard and it has proven results. So that's the reason we do use this as our approach to determine the peak user load, and then we can monitor the performance. So by continuously monitoring the performance metrics and observe when the application starts to degrade, so we have to look for increases in response times, the error rates, and even the server resource usage. And finally, adjusting and retesting. So based on the results, we have to adjust the load testing scenarios and we have to optimize the application or infrastructure, and we can retest to ensure the improvement. So this approach, again, all these approaches that we have discussed so far will help us to effectively determine the peak user load for our new application, which will ensure that it is prepared to handle the real world traffic efficiently. So with that, I come to an end, and I believe this video will be very useful to you. So until I meet you in our next video, it's bye bye from Vasan Shanmugam and your favorite Little's Law YouTube channel. Take care and bye bye.